It was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels final. I stood in front of Graham's casket, not crying, not shaking, just still. My hands were folded so tightly together they ached. People around me whispered condolences, touched my shoulder, avoided my eyes. I barely noticed them. I kept looking at the polished wood of the coffin, thinking of how much he hated oak. He always said it was too traditional, and yet here we were. I had been married to that man for 33 years. We built a life, raised a daughter, paid off a mortgage, fought about taxes and dinner plans, and spent entire holidays pretending we were fine. But in the end, he died just like he lived the last decade of our marriage, without saying what he really felt. Until that moment. Marcus Hill, Graham's law partner and supposed best friend, walked up after the service. He waited until most people had trickled away. I was standing near the floral arrangements, still frozen, when he appeared beside me. "Laura," he said softly, "Graham left something for you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box, smooth, dark, unassuming. "He asked me to give you this after the funeral, personally." I stared at the box like it might burn my fingers. Marcus didn't say anything else, just gave me a small nod, squeezed my arm, and walked away. I held the box all the way home like it might break if I let go. That night, when the house was silent again, Rachel had gone back to her hotel, and the fridge hummed like it always did when I couldn't sleep. I finally opened it. Inside was a single USB drive, silver, engraved with his initials. I plugged it into the old laptop in the guest room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than they should have. I didn't know what I expected. A will? A slideshow? Some files about insurance? What I didn't expect, what I wasn't ready for, was his voice. "If you're watching this, Alara, it means I'm gone, and you finally deserve the truth." My chest tightened. My hand instinctively reached for the corner of the desk to brace myself. There's so much I should have said, but I didn't. I thought there'd be more time. I thought you'd always be there and I could keep pretending that was enough. My eyes filled, but I didn't blink. "You weren't invisible, Alara. I saw everything, I just didn't know how to love you the way you deserved. I left some things behind, things I should have said to your face. But you'll find them now, and maybe, when you do, you'll finally understand that it was never about you being unworthy. It was about me being afraid." I paused the video. My hand was shaking too much to keep going. I didn't understand what he meant. What things? What truth? I sat back in the old swivel chair and stared at the screen, at his paused face. The same face I'd watched fall asleep beside me for decades. The same face that had stopped seeing me long ago. There was more to the video. I could feel it. And part of me didn't want to know what came next. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in all those years of silence, it was this. The truth doesn't just hurt, it haunts. But I had already opened the box, and there was no going back. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. There was a time I thought I had it all. Our little Cape Cod-style house on Elmwood Lane wasn't the biggest or fanciest, but it had personality. The walls echoed with the scent of old books and cinnamon, and every window had sheer curtains I'd sewn by hand. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Our home. Graham and I met when I was 24, working part-time at a university library while saving for grad school. He came in looking for a book on estate tax law. I helped him find it, and we ended up talking for nearly an hour. Not about taxes, but about poetry. He said he liked Robert Frost. I said I preferred Mary Oliver. He laughed and said, "She's softer. You seem softer too." I suppose that was the first time I mistook being noticed for being loved. Graham was charming back then. Sharp, ambitious, always a little mysterious. He'd walk me to my car after my shifts, bring me tea without asking how I liked it. He just somehow knew. I remember thinking he saw me in a way no one else ever had. He listened, or at least it felt like he did. When he proposed a year later, I said yes, before he finished asking. We married in a small ceremony behind his mother's church. I wore a borrowed veil. He wore a navy suit and forgot the ring. We laughed. It felt like the beginning of something sacred. After Rachel was born, everything shifted in that quiet, inevitable way things do. I gave up grad school to be a stay-at-home mother. Graham's firm began growing, and he was gone more often. Long hours, out-of-town conferences, client dinners. But when he came home, he'd kiss my forehead, thank me for dinner, and ask how Rachel was doing. He never really asked about me, but I didn't mind, not then. In those early years, I thought we were a good team. He handled the outside world, I handled the inside one. I made our house warm. I knew all Rachel's friends. I packed Graham's lunches with handwritten notes on Fridays. He rarely mentioned them, but I liked imagining him reading them in the middle of his busy day. Sundays were our days. We had a tradition of going for drives without a destination. Just the two of us, quiet music playing, windows down. I lived for those drives. We didn't talk about much. Sometimes he'd vent about work or I'd share a quote I read, but mostly we just drove. It was our language. For years, I told myself this was enough. He wasn't cruel, he didn't cheat, he never raised his voice. And if he seemed distant, well, that's just how some men are, right? That's what people say, that men become quieter as they age, that marriage becomes routine, that women should be grateful if he comes home at all. And I believed that. I really did. Until the quiet stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like abandonment. But back then, in the safety of that false peace, I loved him. Or maybe I loved the version of him I had in my head. The one from the library, from the Sunday drives, from the early days when he made me feel like I was worth listening to. I still have a drawer filled with old receipts he scribbled love notes on. One of them reads, "To the woman who makes the world quieter just by being in it." It's from 1997. I found it stuck behind a photo of Rachel when she was 3. Sometimes I take it out and run my fingers over the fading ink. It's a reminder of what I thought we were, and maybe in some small way of what we could have been, if he just kept choosing me. But I didn't know all that yet. Back then, I thought we were fine. I thought being invisible was the same thing as being loved without question. I thought I was safe. It was the kind of moment most people wouldn't even remember, the kind that passes in a blink, unless you're the one it happens to. Rachel's law school graduation was a bright spring day in Boston, the kind where the air feels fresh, like everything is blooming. Graham and I drove up the night before, stayed in a modest hotel just outside the city. He spent most of the evening on the phone with clients while I laid out Rachel's card and a small gift, a fountain pen engraved with her initials. She loved handwritten letters as a child. I hoped somehow she still did. The morning of the ceremony, we all left the hotel together. Rachel walked ahead with her friends, hair curled just the way she liked it, high heels clicking on the sidewalk like punctuation marks. Graham was in one of his best suits, holding the gift bag in one hand and his phone in the other. We arrived at the venue early. The graduates were ushered into one building, families into another. People poured into the auditorium, laughing, saving seats, waving at distant cousins. I turned around to ask Graham where he wanted to sit, and he was gone. I scanned the room and saw him up front, already seated next to Marcus and 2 other colleagues from the firm. They were chatting easily, like this was just another networking event. I stood at the back, unsure whether to join them or wait until the room settled. Surely he'd look up, wave, signal me over. He didn't. I hovered near the aisle for a few more minutes, hugging the gift bag to my chest. Eventually, an usher gestured for me to take a seat. Any seat. I ended up near the back, behind a large support column that blocked most of the stage. When Rachel crossed the platform and accepted her degree, I strained to see her. I clapped as loud as I could. Tears pricked my eyes. Pride mostly. But something else too. Something cold. After the ceremony, outside in the courtyard, Graham finally spotted me. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly and handed me the gift bag. "Here," he said. "You should be the one to give it to her. It's from us." I smiled, small, tight, and walked over to Rachel. She hugged me quickly, took the bag, and disappeared back into a crowd of classmates. I watched as she pulled out the pen, glanced at it, then tucked it into her purse without a word. We went out to dinner that night, all three of us. Graham talked about Rachel's job prospects, about the firm expanding. Rachel asked questions, laughed easily, toasted to her future. I nodded along, offering a comment here and there. They didn't notice when I stopped talking altogether. Later, in the hotel room, I finally said it. "You didn't save me a seat." Graham looked up from his phone, confused. "What?" "At the graduation. You just sat down and left me standing there." He blinked. "Oh, I figured you'd find something. You're good at that." I waited for more. An apology, a laugh, a sorry I didn't think. But he was already back to scrolling through emails. That night, I laid in bed next to him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. His breathing was steady, even. I turned to face the wall and wondered why that moment hurt so much. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't about wood or distance or obstructed views. It was the ease with which he forgot me. The casual way he slipped into a world where I wasn't part of the picture. That moment at the graduation was the first time I realized that Graham no longer looked for me in a room. He didn't even think to. It didn't blow up into a fight. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't bring it up again. But I remembered. I stored it. And something inside me, something small and quiet, started to shift. A voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "You're disappearing." It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow fade. At first, it was the little things. The morning kisses that turned into nods, the inside jokes that stopped landing, the way he'd sit at the dinner table with his phone in one hand and his fork in the other, never really looking up. I'd talk about something I read, or a new neighbor who moved in, and he'd hum politely, eyes still on his screen, like I was background noise, pleasant, predictable, forgettable. I began filling in the silence. I talked more than usual just to keep the air between us from hardening. I'd ask how his day was, compliment his tie, remind him of Rachel's childhood stories just to get a smile. But it became like dancing alone. Every word I offered felt like tossing pennies into a well that never echoed back. Once, I printed one of my old poems, something I'd written before we were married, and left it on his nightstand. I found it in the trash the next morning, folded in half like a receipt. He never mentioned it. There were dinners where we'd sit for 20 minutes without saying a word. He didn't seem angry. He wasn't mean. He was just elsewhere. And I kept telling myself it was normal, that after decades of marriage, maybe this is what love settles into. Routine, quiet, familiarity. But it wasn't love I was feeling. It was loneliness, dressed up as peace. I stopped sharing things after a while. Not because I didn't want to, but because I started rehearsing every sentence in my head and asking, "What's the point?" He'd nod, maybe a grunt in agreement, then change the subject, or not respond at all. Once I told him about a woman at the library who recognized me from a poetry reading I'd done years ago. She said one of my lines helped her during her divorce. I was excited. It made me feel like I still had something to offer, like I was still me. Graham's response? Library folks are always sentimental. That was all. He didn't ask what the line was. He didn't ask how I felt, just brushed it off like dust on his sleeve. Another time, I made his favorite dish, lemon thyme chicken, mashed potatoes with garlic butter, and roasted carrots. It was a Friday, the end of a long week, and I thought maybe we could have one of our old no-TV dinners. Just the two of us, music playing, wine poured. He came home late, dropped his briefcase by the door and said, "I already ate. Had a thing with a client." He didn't even walk into the kitchen. I sat at the table alone, eating cold carrots. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the plate. I just felt numb, like a painting hung in a hallway no one walks through anymore. Rachel had started calling less by then. She was busy, her firm, her fiancé, her life. When we did talk, she asked about Dad more than she asked about me. Is he traveling next month? Is the firm growing? Is he still thinking of retiring early? I'd answer with a smile in my voice. I always sounded fine. That was my role, the steady one, the caretaker, the filler of silences. but inside I felt like a ghost wrapped in familiar skin. The part that hurt the most wasn't the neglect. It was how easily I accepted it, how I'd normalized it. I had built a life around making space for him, for his needs, his schedule, his moods. And in doing that, I had shrunk myself so small that I barely recognized the woman I used to be. My sister May noticed, though. One weekend, we had tea on her back porch, and she watched me closely while I stirred sugar into my cup. "You don't laugh like you used to," she said. I smiled. "I'm just tired." "No," she said softly. "You're disappearing." That word again. Disappearing. It stayed with me, echoed in the empty spaces where conversations used to live, haunted me in the moments I stood in front of the mirror and didn't see anything worth looking at. This wasn't grief. Not yet. This was erosion, a slow, silent undoing of who I was. And the saddest part was, I didn't even fight it. It was Graham's retirement gala. After 35 years at the firm, they threw him a lavish party at a downtown hotel ballroom. Polished wood floors, string quartet in the corner, champagne flowing from silver fountains. The kind of event you attend to impress, not to connect. I had helped pick out his tuxedo weeks in advance, polished his cufflinks, even steamed his favorite tie the night before. He barely glanced at the dress I wore. It was deep green, the color he once said brought out my eyes, but maybe that was a long time ago, or maybe he just didn't look anymore. We arrived together, but the moment we walked into the ballroom, he drifted toward a circle of partners and clients. I stayed back, letting him shine. I always had. I found a table near the back. The centerpiece was a tower of white roses, elegant, impersonal. I watched him laugh, gesture, hold court like he always did when surrounded by people who mattered to him. I sipped my drink and smiled politely when someone passed. Eventually, Marcus took the stage to give a toast. He was animated, charming, full of stories about late nights, big cases, the firm's early years. The room laughed in all the right places. Then, with a flourish, he waved Graham up to the microphone. Graham adjusted his jacket and approached the podium with that confident, practiced stride. "Thank you, everyone. I'm truly humbled by this evening," he began. "It's been an honor to build something with all of you." He went on, name-dropping colleagues, acknowledging junior partners, cracking a joke about Marcus's golf game. The crowd was eating it up. I watched from my seat, waiting, just hoping he'd mention me. Not even a speech, just a sentence, a nod. Anything. Then he said it. "And of course, I'd like to thank my wife Alara for keeping the bookshelves dust-free and the coffee pot full." Laughter, polite, light-hearted, but it was the kind of laughter that lets you know the room is in on the joke, and you are the punchline. I felt my cheeks flush. My smile froze in place. I gripped the base of my wine glass so tightly I thought it might crack. He moved on quickly, shifting into a sentimental thank you to Rachel for making him proud. More applause, more warmth. No one looked at me. I sat there, invisible again, except now I was invisible in front of 100 people. After the speeches, he came over and kissed the top of my head. "You okay?" he asked, already turning toward the dance floor. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat, like they had too many times before. Later, I excused myself and went into the bathroom, locked myself in a stall and sat there, heels off, dress bunched in my lap, shaking silently. I wasn't crying because he embarrassed me in public. I was crying because I realized something even worse. He didn't think he had. To him, that comment was a harmless joke, a throwaway line, something to lighten the mood. But to me, it was confirmation. That all those years of quiet sacrifice, of fading into the background, of holding the home together, they amounted to a dust rag and a coffee filter. That's how he saw me. That's all I was. When I came out of the stall, my mascara was smudged. A young woman at the mirror offered me a tissue. "You okay?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Just allergies," I lied. She smiled and said, "Well, you look beautiful, if that helps." It didn't, but I thanked her anyway. Back at the table, Graham was already on the dance floor with Rachel, twirling her around like she was still 10 years old and standing on his shoes. I watched them from the shadows, then gathered my purse and walked out into the cold night alone. Outside, the city lights blurred as I blinked hard. I could still hear the music behind me, muffled, cheerful, unaware. That was the night I stopped making excuses for him. I still loved him, or thought I did, but something had broken in that ballroom, and I wasn't sure it could be fixed. After the retirement party, something inside me shut off. Not loudly, but finally. I went through the motions as I always had. I cooked dinner, folded his laundry, smiled at neighbors, but my chest felt hollow, like a room after the furniture's been moved out. I began counting silences the way other people count steps. One morning in early spring, I asked Graham if he wanted to go away for a few days, just the two of us. I suggested the cabin in the mountains where we spent our 10th anniversary, the one with the creaky porch swing and wildflowers in the field. He was sipping his coffee, not really looking at me. "Elara," he said, not unkindly. "We're too old for romantic getaways. Besides, I've got meetings and a conference next week." There was no cruelty in his voice, just dismissal, like I'd suggested something mildly amusing and he didn't have the energy to pretend. That's when I knew. Not that he didn't love me. I'd stopped expecting that, but that he didn't even see the point in trying anymore. That night, I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days, a sweater, my favorite tea, a novel I hadn't touched in years. I left a note on the counter. "Gone to Maze for a while. I need some air. No drama, no scene. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted space where I wasn't invisible." May lived 2 towns over in a little house with wind chimes that never stopped singing. She opened the door and took one look at me before pulling me into a hug. She didn't ask questions. She poured me tea, handed me a blanket, and let me sit in her sunroom for 3 hours without saying a word. I slept in her guest room that night and, for the first time in years, didn't wake up feeling anxious. The next morning, I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what Graham had for breakfast. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I breathed. I stayed at Maze for 12 days. Graham didn't call. Not once. Rachel texted once. Something short, like, "Dad said you needed space. You okay?" I replied, "I'm fine, just taking care of myself." She didn't respond after that. I wasn't angry. That was the strangest part. I thought I'd be furious, devastated, maybe even panicked that he wasn't trying to reach me. But I wasn't. I felt empty, quiet, like I was slowly emerging from under layers of dust and noise that had been pressing down for too long. May suggested I stay longer, even joked about turning the guest room into a Lara's sanctuary. But on the 12th day, I packed my things and returned home. Not because I missed Graham, but because I wanted to face the silence in our house without flinching. When I walked through the front door, nothing had changed. The mail was piled up. The laundry basket was full. Graham was in his study, typing away. He looked up briefly and said, "Hey, you're back." Not, "I missed you." Not, "Are you okay?" Not even a, "How was May?" Just a casual acknowledgement, like I'd gone to the store and come home with groceries. I nodded, put my bag down, and walked past him to our bedroom. He didn't follow. That night, we ate dinner in silence. I made soup. He scrolled through emails. The only sound was the clink of spoons against bowls. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't been forced out of my marriage. Not the way people imagine it, with slammed doors or screaming fights. I hadn't been cheated on. I hadn't been cursed at. I had been slowly erased. And the worst part? I had helped. I had made myself smaller and smaller, more and more convenient until there was nothing left of the woman I used to be. And no one noticed I was gone. But something had shifted during those 12 days at Maze, a quiet awakening, a question that kept rising to the surface. What if I started choosing myself? I didn't know what that looked like yet, but I knew I couldn't go back to who I was before. Not completely, not anymore. It was a Thursday in October. Cold rain tapped against the kitchen windows like it had something urgent to say, but I didn't move. The soup I had started hours earlier had burned on the stove. I forgot to turn the heat down after bringing it to a boil. The smell of scorched onions and overcooked broth filled the house, clinging to the curtains, the furniture, even my clothes. I opened a window, but the wind blew the scent deeper in. Graham came home around 7. He stepped into the kitchen, paused for a second, and sniffed the air. "Burned?" he asked flatly, loosening his tie. I didn't answer. I was standing at the counter, staring into the pot like it held something more important than failure. He walked past me, opened the fridge, and pulled out the takeout menu we kept magneted to the door. "I'll get Chinese. You want anything?" "Doesn't matter," I said quietly. He didn't press. He ordered for himself, poured a glass of water, and disappeared into the living room. I stood there long after he left the kitchen, the soup still bubbling faintly like it didn't know the meal was over. And that was the moment. Not a grand breakdown, not a shouted fight, just me, alone in the kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, in a house I once filled with music and warmth and homemade pies, holding a scorched ladle and realizing this was it. This was my life. I was a background character in my own home. I didn't even feel angry, just hollow. I scraped the soup into the sink, watching it swirl and vanish. The burnt bits clung to the sides of the pot, and I scrubbed at them like if I cleaned hard enough, maybe I could scrub away everything else, too. The numbness, the weight, the aching sense that I had wasted years trying to be indispensable to someone who barely noticed I existed. That night, I didn't eat. Instead, I curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me and stared at the ceiling. There were tiny cracks in the plaster. I'd never noticed them before. They formed strange, spider-like patterns, delicate and growing, just like the ones forming in me. I thought about who I used to be. The woman who filled journals with poetry and ideas, the woman who hosted book clubs and laughed with friends over wine and cheese, the woman who stayed up late whispering with her daughter during sleepovers, the woman who once stood in a bookstore in a blue dress and made a man fall in love with her. I missed her, so badly it hurt. But she was gone. Worn down by years of silence and dismissal, chipped away by little compromises that didn't feel like much at the time but added up to erasure, smoothed down into someone convenient, someone forgettable. I picked up an old photo album that had been sitting on the side table for months. The cover was cracked leather. Inside were pictures from our early years. Graham in his 20s, confident and clean-shaven, holding Rachel on his shoulders at a pumpkin patch. Me smiling so wide my eyes almost disappeared, hair windblown, cheeks flushed. We looked like people who had a story. I ran my fingers over that photograph and felt something rise in my chest. Grief, yes, but not just for what I lost, for what I gave up willingly, one piece at a time. It's strange what rock bottom looks like. People imagine it's some kind of dramatic collapse, a divorce, a betrayal, an explosion. But sometimes it's just a quiet kitchen, a cold floor, a burned meal, and the sudden realization that you've been alone for years and didn't even notice. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in the dark until the heater kicked on and the vents groaned like the house itself was sighing. And I whispered into the emptiness, "I don't want to feel like this anymore." It wasn't a declaration. It was a beginning. The day of the funeral was gray and windless, like the sky had gone still out of respect or pity. I wore a black coat that used to be Graham's favorite on me. He once said it made me look elegant, like someone out of an old movie. That was years ago. He hadn't said anything about my clothes in over a decade. Still, I wore it. Maybe for him, maybe for me. The service was formal and cold. Rachel sat beside me, dabbing her eyes now and then, looking more composed than grieving. She always had her father's steel in her. Sharp, polished, controlled. I didn't expect her to fall apart. I just hoped she'd reach for my hand. She didn't. After the final hymn, when the crowd began to disperse, Marcus Hill, Graham's longtime law partner, approached me. His suit was immaculate, as always, and his tone gentle in that rehearsed way men like him are trained to sound. "Ilara," he said quietly, holding a small dark wooden box in his hands. "Graham left this for you, asked me to give it to you personally, after the service." I stared at the box for a moment before taking it. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of wood that holds secrets. Marcus gave me a faint smile, touched my arm, and walked away. No one asked what was inside. No one cared. That night, after everyone had gone, after Rachel returned to her hotel, after the casserole dishes had been stacked in the fridge, after the silence took over again, I sat at the kitchen table with the box in front of me. It had no lock, no inscription, just a smooth, finished surface that caught the overhead light. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single silver USB drive, engraved with two simple letters. GM. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear his voice again. The thought of it made my chest tighten, like I might shatter before the first word. But I plugged it in. The laptop was old, the one I used to write poems on, the one Rachel used for school essays. It whirred to life slowly, like even it had to brace itself. There was only one file, a video. The thumbnail was a still image of Graham, sitting in what looked like his office, wearing the navy sweater I'd given him one Christmas, the one he never wore in front of me. I clicked play, and there he was. If you're watching this, Alara, it means I'm gone, and you finally deserve the truth. My breath caught. His voice was softer than I remembered, tired, less guarded. I should have said this in person. I should have said it years ago, but I didn't, and now I can't. I know I hurt you, not with what I did, but with what I didn't do, with the silence, with the forgetting. I pressed my hand to my mouth. You were never invisible to me, Alara. I saw everything, every quiet sacrifice, every look you gave me when you were still hoping I'd come back to you. I didn't know how to be the man you deserved, but I knew I had to leave you something better than silence. He looked off camera briefly, as if collecting his thoughts. There's a key taped to the bottom of this box. It opens locker 118 at Riverbank Storage. I kept something there. For you, it's not money, it's something more honest. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that you mattered, even when I forgot how to show it. The screen went black. I sat there, stunned, my heart pounding like it had been held underwater and suddenly surged to the surface. I flipped the box over with shaking hands, and sure enough, there it was, a small silver key, taped with care, labeled 118. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, the box on my chest, his voice echoing in my head. Not because it fixed anything, but because for the first time in years, Graham had truly seen me. And somewhere in a dusty storage locker, he had left something behind. Something waiting to be found. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I hadn't slept. Not really, I just lay there in the stillness, the silver key resting on the nightstand beside me, catching faint slices of morning light. I kept turning it over in my hand, wondering how something so small could weigh so much. Riverbank Storage was 20 minutes away. I hadn't been there in years. Not since Graham stored our old filing cabinets and a broken piano he never got around to fixing. It was the kind of place you drove past without thinking. Rows of identical orange doors, a keypad at the gate, cold concrete and metal. I didn't tell Rachel I was going. I didn't tell May. I just got in my car, hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, and drove through fogged streets that still smelled like rain. Locker 118 was near the back. I slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. The door groaned upward, revealing a single wooden trunk in the center of the space. That was it. No boxes, no furniture, just the trunk. Deep brown, old but polished, like it had been kept with care. I knelt down, heart pounding, and opened the lid. Inside were journals, at least a dozen, each with a black leather cover neatly labeled by year. 2003, 2004, 2005, and so on. Some years had multiple volumes, some only one. Beneath the journals was a manila folder with my name written on it in Graham's familiar cursive. I took the folder first, sat cross-legged on the cold concrete, and opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten. Ilara, it began. If you're reading this, then you've already heard the worst of me. And still, there's more I have to confess. Not the kind of sins people whisper about, the quiet ones, the ones that live in what we didn't say, didn't do, didn't notice. I watched you disappear right in front of me, and I hated myself for letting it happen. I stopped and wiped my face with my sleeve. The letter continued. I kept these journals not to hide things, but because writing helped me see things I was too cowardly to say. You deserved more, and though I can't give you that now, maybe these pages will help you understand what I couldn't give voice to. He had signed it the same way he did in his early love letters. Yours still, Graham. I reached into the trunk and took out the first journal. The leather was soft from use. When I opened it, I found page after page of raw, aching truth. Not just about me, but about him, his fears, his regrets, his love for Rachel, his confusion, his guilt. One entry from 2009 read, Alara made lemon chicken tonight. I barely said thank you. She looked tired. I wonder if she knows I see her. God, I hope she knows. I'm failing her. But I don't know how to come back. Another from the night of his retirement gala. I made a joke during the speech. People laughed. But when I saw her face, I knew I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I wanted to say sorry. I didn't. I never do. What's wrong with me? The words pierced me. Not because they absolved him, but because they made him human again. Graham hadn't hated me. He hadn't even stopped loving me, not entirely. He had simply lost himself in the noise of his own life, in ambition, in ego, in fear. And I had lost myself in the silence of his absence. I sat there for hours, reading, crying, laughing bitterly at his self-deprecating jokes scrawled in the margins. But more than anything, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. He had noticed. Not always in time. Not always well. But he had seen me. In his own broken, flawed way. And more importantly, I was starting to see myself again. The woman who stayed. The woman who endured. The woman who still had something to say. That evening, I drove home with the trunk in the back seat and the folder pressed against my chest like armor. Not because I forgave him, but because I wasn't waiting for his permission to begin again. I was done fading, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but something just as powerful, resolve. After I brought the trunk home, I didn't tell anyone about it. Not Rachel, not May, not even the neighbors who stopped by with flowers and casseroles, gently suggesting that I take things slow. I smiled and thanked them. I knew they meant well, but I wasn't grieving in the way they expected. I was waking up. Every morning after Graham's funeral, I made a pot of coffee, not for two, just for me, and carried a journal out to the back porch. I wrapped myself in an old blanket and read his words as the sun rose over the yard we'd shared for decades. Some entries made me cry. Some made me furious. But almost all of them made me feel awake. It wasn't just the truth of his regrets that stirred something inside me. It was the realization that I had been living in shadows for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something for myself. That's when I began the work, quietly, carefully. I started with the finances. Graham had always handled the bills, the accounts, the investments. I had access, but I never interfered. I had told myself it was respect. Now I realized it was conditioning. I logged into our accounts, checked every statement, and made a list of assets. The folder from the storage locker had included a list of holdings. Properties, stocks, firm shares. He had left me more than enough, but he'd also left instructions. Don't just survive. Use it. Build something. So I made an appointment with a financial planner. I told Rachel I had some errands in the city. She didn't ask questions. She assumed, I think, that I was tying up loose ends. In truth, I was untying knots I hadn't even known were strangling me. I went through every document Graham had stored away. Trusts, insurance policies, even letters addressed to Rachel and Marcus. And I began writing my own letters, too, to banks, to the firm, to the retreat center I'd once donated to in Vermont. That retreat was more than a memory. It was the seed of an idea. Graham's journals had been filled with reflections on the emotional labor women carry. He had quoted lines of poetry I'd long forgotten. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? As if reminding himself, or me, that time was running out. He had known I'd stayed, that I'd shrunk, but he also knew I hadn't broken. That realization gave me power. Not loud, movie scene power, not revenge or vindication. Just quiet, steady power. The kind that lives in clarity. At night, I started writing again. Poems, notes to myself. Ideas for a space where women like me, the quiet ones, the tired ones, the overlooked, could come to breathe again. I drafted a proposal for a women's retreat, a place for healing, reflection, and starting over. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't make an announcement on Facebook or even bring it up to May. I just worked, slowly, purposefully, alone. I wasn't hiding, I was building. Rachel still called occasionally. Quick, efficient conversations about the estate, probate, paperwork. She was all business. I let her be. She didn't ask what I was doing with my days, and I didn't offer. I wanted to keep this for myself, at least for now. In the quiet of those early mornings and late nights, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not forgiveness, not closure, ownership of my time, my space, my voice. I looked around our house and began changing things. I painted the walls of the guest room pale blue. I replaced Graham's office desk with a small writing nook. I took down the framed certificates he'd hung in the hallway and replaced them with vintage botanical prints I found at an estate sale. It wasn't about erasing him. It was about making space for me. Every choice, every change was deliberate, and I didn't need applause or permission because something in me had shifted. For years, I had been the woman who waited for attention, for kindness, for acknowledgement, for a man to remember her. Now I was becoming the woman who moved in silence, not because she was afraid, but because she was focused. The setup had begun, and the world, my world, was about to change. Power doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it walks in softly, unnoticed, until everything around it begins to change. The first sign came during a phone call with Marcus. "Ilara," he said casually, "will need your signature on a few firm transition documents." I was sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by Graham's journals and my growing retreat plans. I hadn't spoken to Marcus since the funeral. "What kind of documents?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just standard ownership transfers. Graham left you a few shares in the firm, mostly symbolic." I didn't say anything. I'd already read through the trust Graham left behind. He hadn't left me a few shares. He'd left me 51%. Majority ownership, controlling interest. I could hear Marcus shuffle papers on the other end of the line. "I'll send someone by with the file," he added. "No need," I said. "I'll have my attorney review it." There was a pause. "Ilara, you have counsel?" I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it felt good. To surprise someone who had never seen you as anything more than a name on an invitation list. "Yes," I replied. "I do." The shift had begun. Over the next few weeks, I made more moves, quiet ones. I hired an accountant, opened a separate business account for the retreat, transferred a portion of the trust Graham had set aside for legacy projects into a private fund. Each step I took felt like reclaiming a part of me I'd left behind. I started visiting properties. There was a small piece of land in Vermont. Graham had purchased it years ago and never told anyone. It sat near a lake tucked between evergreens, with a view that made you feel like you could exhale for the first time in years. That would be the place. I just knew. Meanwhile, Rachel began to notice something was different. One evening, she stopped by the house unannounced. She looked around the living room, her eyes landing on the cleared space where Graham's golf trophies once stood. "You've been redecorating," she said, not quite a question. "I have." She picked up one of the botanical prints I hadn't hung yet. "This doesn't really feel like Dad. It's not meant to." She glanced at me. "You're not planning to sell the house, are you?" "No." "Then what are you planning?" I took a sip of tea before answering. "Living." She didn't respond, not right away. Instead, she set the frame down and walked around the room like she was in a museum she didn't quite understand. I didn't explain further. The power wasn't in defending myself. It was in not needing to. For so long, my worth had been measured by how small I could make myself to keep others comfortable. Now I was making space, not for revenge, not for attention, but for peace. Even the staff at the law firm noticed. I visited once to sign paperwork, and the receptionist, a young woman named Haley, looked up and smiled nervously. "You're Mrs. Monroe, right?" "I am." She hesitated, then added, "Everyone's been talking about the trust." I raised an eyebrow. "Have they?" "Yeah, 51%, that's a big deal." I smiled. "Yes, it is." I walked into the boardroom that day like a woman who belonged there, not because I had something to prove, but because I didn't. Marcus looked uncomfortable, flanked by younger partners who tried not to make eye contact. I shook his hand and sat at the head of the table. "We'll keep the firm running as Graham intended," I said simply, "but we'll also begin exploring community outreach programs, scholarships, free clinics for single mothers. It's in line with some of the charitable notes he left in his journals." There was silence, then a nod, then agreement. Because I wasn't asking, I was stating. And in that room, in that moment, I felt something shift inside me for good. I had spent years waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be invited in. But now, the door was open, and I was walking through it. Not because someone pulled out a chair, but because I brought my own. It happened on a Sunday. Rachel invited herself over for dinner. She said it casually, as though it had always been her idea, though I had a strong suspicion Marcus had mentioned my increasing presence at the firm. I could feel the shift in her tone. Less daughter, more attorney. Measured, polite, and gently probing. I didn't mind. I was no longer trying to prove myself to anyone, not even her. Still, I prepared dinner like I always did. Roasted rosemary chicken, warm sourdough, sautéed greens. The kind of meal she used to love when she was young, before every conversation between us became a negotiation. We ate in near silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware and her occasional comments about the firm's transition. I could tell she was circling something, waiting for the right moment. It came after dessert. I had just finished clearing the table when she folded her napkin precisely, laid it on her plate, and said, "You've been making a lot of decisions without including me?" I looked at her calmly. "Yes, I have." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "The firm's direction, the property in Vermont, the retreat. You didn't mention any of it." I sat down across from her. "Because I didn't need to." She tilted her head. "Dad would have—" "Your father," I said, my voice steady but firm, "left all of it to me, not just the shares. Not just the land, but the responsibility, the truth." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I rose from the table, walked into the living room, and returned with one of Graham's journals. I placed it in front of her, open to a page I had bookmarked. "Read that," I said. She glanced down. Her eyes scanned the page. At first she looked skeptical, then surprised, then still. It was an entry dated 3 years before his death. Graham had written about me, about Rachel, about the night of his retirement party. I joked about Alara's role, called her the keeper of coffee and dust. The room laughed. She didn't. I saw it. She sat perfectly still. It was the moment I realized I had made her small for so long. She believed she was. I failed her more times than I can count, and I keep failing her by staying silent. Rachel's mouth parted just slightly. "I'm not playing victim," I said quietly. "I played silent for years. I stood behind your father at every event, every dinner, every achievement. I gave up my career, my passions, my voice. And when I disappeared, no one noticed. Not even you." She looked up at me, defensiveness battling with guilt in her expression. "Mom, I don't need your apology, Rachel," I said gently. "And I don't need your approval." She sat back in her chair, blinking hard. "Why are you showing me this? Because one day you may wake up and wonder who you've become. And I want you to know that it's never too late to stop shrinking yourself for people who only love you when you're useful." I let the silence stretch. Then I stood and began clearing the dishes, my back to her, my hands steady. Behind me, I heard her close the journal softly. When she left an hour later, she hugged me. Quick, tentative, unfamiliar. Like she wasn't sure what to do with the woman standing in front of her now. And I didn't reach to hold her longer, because I didn't need to. That confrontation wasn't about winning. It wasn't about guilt or getting even. It was about truth. I had spent a lifetime being careful. With my words, my needs, my presence. But that night, I took up space in my own home, spoke the truth plainly, and stood in it without shaking. Not for applause, not for reconciliation, but for myself. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't raise her voice. It's raise her standard and refuse to lower it ever again. 2 weeks after that dinner with Rachel, I received a call from Marcus. His voice was composed, but I could hear the tension beneath it, that slight tightness men use when they're trying to maintain control. "Ilara," he said, "we need to talk about the firm's scholarship initiative. There's some concern among the partners about its direction." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make a point. "Is the concern financial or philosophical?" He cleared his throat. "Well, both, to be honest. Some feel the shift toward community programming is beyond the firm's scope. And yet," I replied calmly, "it's entirely within the legal and discretionary framework outlined in Graham's legacy clause. He was very clear about that in the trust." Another pause. He hadn't expected me to read everything. He certainly hadn't expected me to understand it. But I had read it. All of it. I had sat with a lawyer line by line and gone through every clause my husband had carefully structured before his death. That's when I knew what Graham had done. He hadn't just left me wealth. He had left me power. Deliberately, precisely, and legally binding. He had written a clause that stipulated a portion of the firm's profits be redirected annually to humanitarian efforts led by the controlling partner. He named me directly, not Marcus, not the firm's board, me. He had never said the words to my face, but in death, he made sure no one could silence me again. That was the final twist. Graham had known what he took from me, and somewhere in the quiet corners of his guilt, he tried to give it back. In the only language he understood. Documents, money, influence. He knew no apology would ever be enough. But he gave me something better, the ability to decide what came next. I ended the call with Marcus politely. Then I went to my desk and pulled out the proposal I'd spent weeks refining. The retreat would be called The Quiet Voice, a nod to both the woman I had become and the one I had silenced for too long. It would be a space for women to rest, to grieve, to rebuild. It would host workshops on healing, financial independence, creative expression. It would house a library filled with the kinds of books that once made me feel less alone. The land Graham purchased in Vermont, untouched, serene, and surrounded by evergreens, would be its home. I submitted the paperwork that afternoon. The firm would be its first donor, whether the partners liked it or not. 2 days later, the local paper called me. They had received the press release. They wanted a quote. I said, "This retreat is about reclaiming what we've been taught to give up, our time, our value, our voices." The article ran under the headline, "Widow of Prominent Lawyer Opens Healing Center for Women," funded by the firm that once overlooked her. The irony was almost poetic. The justice wasn't loud. No one was arrested, no revenge plots unfolded. But the men who had once raised glasses to Graham while ignoring the woman beside him now had to answer to her, and not one of them dared challenge it. The final twist wasn't just that Graham left me the power. It was that I learned how to use it without needing him at all. I stood alone now. Not broken, not bitter, but rebuilt. And the very system that once erased me now bore my name at the bottom of every check that helped another woman rise. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up with signed papers, bank transfers, and the sound of your own voice finally saying, "This is mine now." It was early spring when Rachel came to the retreat. The last patches of snow had melted into the soil, and the trees were just beginning to bud. Everything smelled fresh, like the world was trying again. I was in the main lodge arranging welcome packets for the next group of women when I saw her through the window, standing at the edge of the gravel path, suitcase in hand, uncertainty written all over her face. She looked smaller than usual, not physically but emotionally, like the armor she wore in every conversation had started to crack. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. We just stared at each other for a moment. "I didn't know where else to go," she finally said. "You found the right place," I replied softly. No hug, no dramatic tears, just honesty. I led her inside, gave her a tour of the grounds, and set her up in one of the corner rooms. The ones that got morning light and overlooked the lake. It was the same room I had stayed in when I first visited the land alone, long before the retreat had walls or beds or guests. That night, we didn't talk much. She joined me for dinner with a few of the women already checked in. No one knew who she was to me. That's how it works here. We don't label or define. Everyone arrives as themselves, not somebody's wife or daughter or title. She listened quietly as the women shared stories over tea, about burnout, about loneliness, about being the last person they remembered taking care of. Rachel didn't speak, but I saw the way her shoulders softened, the way her gaze lingered on a woman her own age who had walked away from a loveless marriage after 22 years. The way she smiled, just barely, when someone cracked a gentle joke about forgetting who they were before kids. Later, in the quiet of the main lodge, she found me sitting by the fireplace, journal in hand. "Was Dad always like that?" she asked. I closed the journal. "No," I said. "He wasn't always dismissive. When we were young, he listened. He showed up. He tried." She nodded slowly. "I think I always blamed you, for being small, for being invisible." My throat tightened. "I thought maybe you just didn't try hard enough to be heard," she added. I looked at her then, not with anger but with something deeper, a kind of sadness mixed with grace. "I stopped trying because no one was listening," I said, and eventually I stopped believing I had anything to say. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded, not as forgiveness, not yet, but as acknowledgement. We sat there in the firelight, the only sound the slow crackle of logs and the hum of wind against the windows. Before she went to bed, I walked her to her room. Just before she stepped inside, I handed her something, one of Graham's journals, not one filled with legal talk or regrets about the firm. A personal one that mentioned her often. "This one's about you," I said. Her eyes widened slightly as she took it. "Do you think he ever really understood?" I shrugged. "I think he tried in his own flawed way." She nodded, clutching the journal like it might slip away. "I don't expect this to fix us," she said. "I'm not asking it to." She stepped inside and gently closed the door. I stood there for a moment, alone in the hallway, feeling the weight of years lift just slightly from my chest. The next morning, I found her sitting on the porch overlooking the lake, the journal open in her lap, her eyes red but peaceful. We didn't speak. We didn't need to, because reconnection doesn't always come in the form of apologies or grand gestures. Sometimes it shows up as quiet presence, as a daughter showing up where her mother once disappeared, as two women, no longer just mother and child, sitting side by side, not trying to rewrite the past, but simply choosing to stay in the present. And in that stillness, something fragile and beautiful began to grow. Not reconciliation, but recognition. A year had passed since Graham's funeral. 12 months of silence, growth, grief, rediscovery, layered like seasons over the life I used to live. On the anniversary, I didn't visit his grave. That had never been our place. He was never much for flowers or stones. Instead, I spent the morning walking the trail behind the retreat, wrapped in a soft shawl, the cold spring air brushing against my skin like a quiet reminder. You're still here. The trees were waking up again, buds pushing through gray bark, little birds returning to nests they'd once abandoned. Everything around me was beginning again, and so was I. I sat down on a weathered bench overlooking the lake, the same one Rachel had sat on the morning after I handed her the journal. She wasn't here now, She had returned to the city weeks ago, but something had shifted between us. Our phone calls were no longer just logistical. She asked how I was sleeping, what book I was reading, if I needed anything. She never said, "I love you." Not yet. But sometimes she said, "I'm thinking of you." And that was enough. In my lap was the last journal Graham ever wrote. I hadn't opened it until this morning. It wasn't dated like the others. It didn't follow his usual structure. No bulleted regrets, no tidy reflections, just paragraphs. Long, rambling thoughts written in the shaky scrawl of a man who knew he was running out of time. He had written about the first time he saw me, really saw me, in that library. How I had helped him find a book, then recommended one of my favorites instead. He bought both. He wrote about our daughter's birth, the way I had looked at Rachel like she was a poem I had written by hand. He wrote about our silences, how they started slowly, how he wished he had fought harder against the ones that grew roots. And on the last page, he wrote this: "If I could go back, I'd choose her again. But this time, I'd sit at her table, I'd listen, I'd watch. I wouldn't miss her in a room full of people. I'd make sure she knew she was the story, not just the footnote." I closed the journal and held it to my chest, not out of grief, but out of acknowledgement, because it wasn't about Graham anymore. It was about me. I had spent most of my life building a world that made everyone else comfortable, then learning how to live in the discomfort I had silently agreed to, but not anymore. Now I had something I never knew I needed: space, voice, peace. The quiet voice retreat had grown faster than I expected. We had already filled every weekend for the next 4 months. Women from all over the country, teachers, mothers, nurses, artists, daughters, came through our doors carrying invisible weight. Some stayed a weekend, some stayed 2. They left lighter, taller, like they were stepping back into the world for the first time as themselves. Sometimes I'd watch them from the porch, sitting with tea, reading in the sun, laughing softly, and I'd feel a pride deeper than anything I'd ever known. Not because I saved them, but because I finally saved myself. At the edge of the lake, a butterfly landed on the armrest of my bench, its wings speckled with orange and deep blue. It stayed there a long moment, as if offering something I hadn't known I still needed. A blessing, a sign, a whisper. I closed my eyes and let it stay. Not everything had been healed. Not every wound had disappeared, but I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I was choosing presence, because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in being seen by others. It's in seeing yourself, clearly, fully, and without apology. I didn't need to explain what happened anymore. I had lived it, and I had risen from it. Now, I was finally writing my own story. And this time, I was the headline, not the afterthought.